Welcome to Session 3 of the 2020 Autism Hope Summit. This hour's presentation is titled Cultural Alignment of ASD Interventions, Perspectives of Latin Families, and is presented by Dr. Michaela Dubay, an assistant professor and researcher at UVA. I'm going to introduce Michaela and then turn it over to her for the presentation. Michaela Dubay earned her PhD in Speech and Hearing Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is now an assistant professor at UVA. She is also a speech-language pathologist who specializes in early identification and intervention for autism spectrum disorders. Through her research, she is interested in serving culturally and linguistically diverse families through modified assessment and intervention methods. Dr. Dubay's research revolves around the cultural adaptation process for parent-report autism screening tools and parent-mediated interventions, specifically for Spanish-speaking Latin populations. Without further ado, I give you Michaela.
Hi, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm excited to be able to present to everyone today. So I'm sharing my screen here for y'all, hopefully to see. Great. All right, so I'm excited to talk to you about a research project that I did with Latin families. And I'm hoping that the information I learned will be useful for you all in your practice. This presentation is sort of oriented towards clinicians and service providers who are working with families from diverse backgrounds. It's going to be most relevant for those who are working with Spanish-speaking Latin families, but it might also be relevant in thinking about families really from a range of diverse backgrounds. I'm going to go ahead and talk about terminology just for 1 second so no one's confused. As you are likely aware, US English is sort of seeing a transformation in the way that we refer to people of Latin American descent. So historically, we've used terms like Hispanic, more recently Latino, and now folks are starting to use sort of Latinx as a way to take the gender marker out that you see in the Spanish version of the word. So I have communicated with a few people in that cultural group who don't love the term Latinx. I am not a member of that group, and so I don't get to decide, obviously. But I'm going to use the term Latin here to represent people of Latin American descent. You could think Latin music, Latin food, Latin culture. Okay. All right, so back to this project. Thinking about evidence-based interventions. Behavioral intervention is a social activity when you think about it, right? It involves people and how they interact with each other. And just like all other social activities, the way that we do it depends on our cultural norms and our cultural values. We choose therapy targets or therapy goals based on skills that we think are important for a person to learn. We choose therapy strategies based on ways that we think are appropriate for people to learn. And even therapy models, things like what roles do different people play in therapy, how it's carried out. We choose therapy models based on who we think should do what and how when it comes to therapy. And all of those thoughts and those opinions, those are based on our cultural values and our cultural expectations. And so they're bound to vary cross-culturally. So you can imagine, at least hypothetically, that the underlying cultural values of any one intervention might not align with the cultural values of a particular family, right? So the therapy strategies and targets and models that any one therapy uses might not align with the cultural expectations of any one particular family, right? And if you have incongruence between these two, that can lead to conflicts. So differences in the way that we think it should go and the way that it's actually going, right? And what might happen is families might fail to implement strategies appropriately. They might come to therapy less frequently. They might refuse services altogether if they think that they're inappropriate. And this is really relevant when we're thinking about parent-mediated intervention. So that's where we're teaching the parent to carry out the intervention strategies themselves rather than the service provider working directly with the child. And in research, you do see many more parent-mediated interventions that are designed for early intervention, or at least for young children. And it turns out most of these early intervention programs that you see in research, most of them have been tested with white, mid to upper class, monolingual English speaking children and families. Right? It's a fairly homogeneous group, not completely, I won't say, but a somewhat homogeneous group with many similar cultural values. But we do see Latin children, we see other diverse populations as well. We see them being served in increasingly large proportions in early intervention programs. So we have the potential here for that cultural conflict. If the interventions that we all learn about in school and we read about in journals and we research, if all of those are culturally appropriate for a population that's different than our caseload, then we might run into those conflicts. So not implementing strategies, coming to therapy less often, or not coming to therapy at all. And if we want to avoid that, which I think that we do, then that requires us to think about how can we adapt our interventions to kind of meet the needs of these diverse groups. When we're thinking about aligning interventions with a particular culture, parent-mediated intervention is especially ripe for adaptation. It's ripe for those conflicts and incongruencies. As adults, we are very enculturated, right? We are set in our ways. We've already gone through many, many years immersed in our own culture, and we know how to do things. We know how things are done, right? We know what feels right. So when adults are the focus of our intervention and we're teaching them new behaviors and new ways to interact with their children, the potential for that incongruence is going to be really high. So in that light, this project focused on learning how to adapt autism interventions specifically with Latin families. And we wanted to identify autism intervention models, strategies, and targets that are perceived as more culturally appropriate, more feasible, more acceptable for Latin families. And then also we really wanted to understand the variability that is going to exist among these families as well. This was a mixed method study, so it had a quantitative, a numbers portion, and a qualitative portion, like a words focused portion. The quantitative phase used 2 surveys about the perceptions that families had around the early interventions that they were receiving. So the overall kind of quality of their therapy, their satisfaction with their therapy, how family-centered they thought that their therapy was. And we were looking to see if there were differences in the perceptions, between the perceptions of non-Latin, white English-speaking families, so the NLW. I'll just refer to them as white from here on out. But we wanted to see if there was a difference between the perceptions of those white families and Latin Spanish-speaking families of children with autism. And the comparison group, that white group, they're meant to represent the population that has participated in research to develop the most common evidence-based interventions that we have. So if we think that these interventions contain cultural values, then those values are most likely to align with that cultural group. Okay. So that's what we wanted to compare. And then we compared their responses to the responses from the Latin Spanish-speaking families. And then the qualitative phase, the second phase, was accomplished through focus groups. So we were exploring kind of the feasibility and the appropriateness and the acceptability of different evidence-based interventions when it comes to autism. And these focus groups were just with the Latin caregivers. And we had discussions kind of centered around how they perceived their current interventions or their past interventions. I also showed them videos and described some basic evidence-based interventions in autism and asked them questions about whether they felt like the practices were appropriate for their family, if they could carry them out at home, if they would be feasible or difficult, trying to kind of get at how culturally appropriate or culturally relevant they would be for their family. So for this survey, we had 27 white parents and 28 Latin parents. They were mostly in their 30s, some a little older, some a little younger. The kids were around 4 years old, about 75% boys. And then the two groups, the white group and the Latin group, they did differ in education and income levels, which was expected because of differences in the general population. So some researchers don't like it when their demographic characteristics are different between two groups that they're trying to compare. But in this case, that's what we were looking for, because these two samples were representative of the groups that we were targeting, right? So group number one, people who typically participated historically in autism research where we were developing these evidence-based interventions. And that has been most often white, mid to upper class, English-speaking folks, pretty high education and income levels. And then group two was supposed to represent Latin families that are participating now in early intervention programs. So around North Carolina, where this project was taking place, those education and income levels were pretty typical of the local population of Latin families. The white families from the surveys were all from the US and they spoke only English growing up. And then all of the Latin parents were foreign born and spoke only Spanish growing up. And you can see here their countries of origin. Most of them were from Mexico, but we did have a good number from other countries, especially Central America. And you also have a few from Northern South American countries as well. And these were not newly arriving immigrants. They had lived in the US on average 15 years with a range from 7 to 30 years. So they'd been here a while. And then the focus group participants were pretty similar to the Latin participants in this survey phase. Many of them were the exact same participants, but not all of them. We had mostly mothers, but we also had a couple of grandmothers, a father, an aunt, and a caregiving friend. We did have less diversity in the country of origin, in terms of country of origin for the focus groups. Most of the participants in the focus groups were from Mexico. So good to keep that in mind when we're talking about the focus group results. All right, so let's talk about results. There were actually very few differences between the two groups on the surveys that I did. The only difference in the first survey was that white families perceived early intervention to be less helpful than Latin families did in the area of helping their child develop and learn. So that was kind of the opposite of what I thought we would find. And then in terms of how family-centered their interventions were, this was the second survey, there were no differences between the two groups. But according to the focus groups, the Latin families did express a lot of areas of dissatisfaction and need. We didn't see those represented or reflected in terms of differences between the two groups on the surveys. But we did get a lot more information when we were in the discussion setting. So from the focus groups, there were 3 themes that we identified. Those 3 were impact of autism on the Latin family, mix and match therapy strategies, and unmet needs from service providers. So we're going to talk about the first one here, impact of autism on the Latin family. And there were 4 sort of sub-themes that came out of the focus groups that I'll go into. I'm including direct quotes here. They're in English and not in Spanish. The focus groups all occurred in Spanish, but I didn't know how helpful it would be to put up the Spanish translation, and it would make my slides very, very small. Or the text very small. So I just have the English up here for you. So many of the participants mentioned a strong stigma that autism has in the Latin community. You read a lot about this in the literature, and it did come up in the focus groups. They shared that there was not a lot of awareness in their home countries about what developmental disorders were at all or what caused them. They talked about how children with developmental disorders were typically quite shunned from their society and their home countries. And the families faced criticism and judgment from their communities here because of these persistent myths that autism was caused by the parents, or that parents weren't doing the right things to treat it. I'll pause for a second, let you read some of these quotes if you'd like to. The participants, they often talked about how the Latin family is typically very close-knit. So extended family members are depending on each other for support. In the case of some of these families, this is really beneficial. Their extended families knew about the child's diagnosis, they participated in care, and they really helped just kind of support the family overall. However, a larger portion of participants shared negative family experiences, and these really ranged from mild to severe. Some parents had family members who would unintentionally interrupt a child's routine and set the child off, and that was obviously difficult for parents. That was sort of on the more mild side of things. On the more severe side, other families had they'd have family members that would deny anything serious was wrong with the child. They thought that the child was just spoiled. In some cases, the parents faced that same criticism and judgment from their own family members over having caused the disorder or not doing the right things to treat it. And sometimes they would hide the diagnosis from family members to avoid expected conflicts. There were a lot of examples of breaks in families that stemmed from the diagnosis. It was really difficult for parents to maneuver around these family conflicts, especially in the context of expecting and needing so much support from their family ordinarily. And this was an example, this quote, of a family with both. The mother experienced support from one side of the family and then avoided the other side of the family in order to avoid conflicts. And I'll read this one for you. The Latin family is very united. I'm from a Latin family. We're very close. We communicate. We always tell each other everything. For example, if a sibling has a problem, everyone helps. In my case, all my siblings on my side, everyone knows my daughter's diagnosis, and everyone understands me, and everyone has supported me, and everyone has helped me. I am happy with the support I've had from my family. And the family on my husband's side, no, I haven't wanted to tell them because they bring thoughts that aren't going to solve anything. They're going to make the diagnosis a problem. They're not going to help. And for this reason, many families, not all families, but many of them were seeking support elsewhere. They were going to support groups with other Latin families of children with autism. They actually shared these kinds of resources among each other during the break of the focus group, and they would stay after the focus group to exchange phone numbers and talk about support groups and talk about therapies with each other. They were also really interested in the idea of group intervention when we would ask about that. So they'd say that they could learn from each other, that they were all in the same boat and they could understand and support each other. This exchange here, I have the quotes up there. They all got really enthusiastic. They were jumping in and sort of finishing each other's sentences and kind of getting really excited about this idea of group intervention where they could all kind of work together. I did also see parents' culture reflected in which therapy targets they thought were most important. So their priority was most often communication. Most parents prioritize speech. And a lot of parents understood that if they augmented speech with AAC or with sign or something, that might later support speech. But I do want to mention that there were a small number of folks who really thought that sign language, that signing was only appropriate for deaf children, not children with other communication needs. That was a minority, but it came up. Also, communication was really important for families, specifically for safety reasons. They were afraid that without speech, kids wouldn't get their needs met around non-family members, so around like teachers or strangers. And they were afraid that children wouldn't be able to tell parents about safety concerns like bullying. So this mother said, my son distances himself, and it takes a lot for him to make friends. And the other thing that he also doesn't do is defend himself. When someone does something to him, he doesn't defend himself. So she's really worried that he's going to get bullied and hurt at school, and she won't be able to do anything about it because she won't know, because he won't be able to tell her. Other important goals that came up quite a bit were self-regulation and behavior. Also, when parents were talking about their priorities for therapy, therapy targets and therapy goals, there was a balance. They were considering both what they think their child needs to be successful in the future, and also how they perceive that their family and friends and wider community would view their child in the future. And this was evident in one specific example where a mother was sharing that she was helping to teach her son how to point, even though that was inappropriate in her culture. So I'll read this excerpt for you. I'm practical. If I have to leave my culture aside, I will leave it. My son is first. And all of the other participants in the focus group are kind of nodding and vocalizing that they agree at this point. For my son and the well-being of my son, there are things, for example, in my culture that are not right, pointing. But my son needs to learn that pointing. So I'm teaching my son to point. My children come first before my culture. And so, as she's saying this, the other participants in that focus group are really echoing that sentiment. It seemed like the parents were most interested in their child's well-being, which obviously we can all understand, right? But losing your culture in the process is an extremely high cost that most everyone else doesn't have to face. So now, given those concepts and those sub-themes, I looked back more closely at the surveys and I brought out a few items that seemed to be related specifically to social aspects. And it turns out that Latin families were less likely to feel that they had family or friends to talk to and to depend on compared to the white families. So you do see that finding reflected a little bit in the surveys. And then back to the three themes. So the next theme is mix and match therapy strategies. And with that theme, there were three sub-themes. Parents were receiving a variety of messages about strategies. They felt like the ends justified the means when they were choosing difficult strategies. And they were really open to a wide variety of strategies. All right, so that first one, these parents were getting various messages about therapy choices. These messages were coming from therapists, from family members, from friends, from other parents, from teachers, online. Sometimes these opinions or messages were conflicting. So I had a parent say they had told me to speak to him with gestures. Later, they told me that's not good because if you begin to teach them to speak with gestures, then they're going to get accustomed to that, and then it makes it a little harder. Right? Parents were doing their best to use the strategies that they perceived to work best with their children. And these were typically visual prompts. These are the ones that they mentioned to me specifically most often that they were using. So visual prompts, structured schedules, choices, reward plans, or enhanced sensory input. But that meant inevitably that they weren't using any comprehensive plans. They were really mixing and matching therapy strategies kind of for the moment or the situation. And that often left them feeling really overwhelmed by the whole thing. So one parent said, with this hyperactivity, we have to work tired because the ones tired out just end up being us. So then we try to give him tasks, but it's hard, honestly. As far as which strategies they preferred, caregivers were most concerned about how successful or how effective a strategy was, and less concerned about how culturally appropriate it was or how difficult it would be to implement. A lot of caregivers commented that some strategies were difficult at first for them to learn, but they were worth the effort once they learn them if the strategy was effective. So one person said, it breaks my heart so much that he has to do that, but it said he has to be independent. But there were examples of caregivers who gave up on strategies that were too difficult for them to maintain. So I wondered whether that difficulty in maintaining some strategies was, some of this potential cultural conflict piece. Did they stop because the activities didn't flow with their daily life? Did it feel unnatural to them? Does that have something to do with culture? Either way, they were happy with a therapy strategy if they felt that it was effective. And they were willing to go outside of their comfort zone if it meant that their child would improve. These were the basic strategies that I discussed with the families: modeling and video modeling, prompting, naturalistic strategies, and discrete trials. I was kind of trying to choose common strategies, but strategies that were fairly different from each other. Modeling was considered by participants to be pretty easy and a useful strategy depending on the child's skill level. Some parents were frustrated when their child did not imitate the model. So clinically speaking, they might need support to know kind of when a model is going to be effective and when they might need extra support to follow a model, like if the child has the motor ability to do the task or if they have imitation skills, things like that. Video modeling was often unfamiliar to participants. They hadn't heard of it before, but they thought it could be potentially beneficial since their children were really interested in technology and they had really good many of them had good visual learning skills. They thought it could be feasible if they could use like a phone or something like that. And they wanted to make sure, they were concerned about safety and making sure that their child didn't access something that they shouldn't. So I think teaching parents kind of where to find appropriate videos, how to play them on their phone as a video model, maybe how to make a video, how to set up the situation so that their child will watch and then immediately, try and do the activity so that they can learn from that video model. That might be a great idea. Among the strategies that I presented, these parents especially appreciated prompting. A lot of caregivers were already using verbal and visual prompting strategies at home. One participant said, everything was working with visuals, and I walked around everywhere with visuals. A lot of participants viewed physical prompting as especially positive because it incorporated physical connection with the child. So one mother shared, it's physical contact with me or with the dad or the person that's helping him. And I find it a good way of boosting his independence. He will feel more able to do things himself because he'll have a framework of what it is he has to do. And that's the opposite of what I would have said, right? I was taught as in terms of, I'm a speech language pathologist. I went to graduate school. All of the journal articles that I read and all of the instruction that I was provided was along the lines of, physical prompting is the highest level of prompting. It should be used minimally. It's very difficult to fade. And so you should, try and avoid using it. But does that come from my cultural background, right? Does that come from the same white, mid to upper class English speaking cultural background? And we have to think about what's true for me and my cultural background might not be different for other families and their backgrounds, right? So when I think that, physical prompting should be avoided, maybe that's not something that's true with families from Latin American backgrounds. So prompting might be a great strategy to help parents use, since it seems they might be really comfortable with it and open to using it. Participants were conflicted about the various facets of naturalistic interventions. Most of them felt that responsive behaviors, like following the child's lead, they thought that these were really natural and easy to implement. One parent said, I think that with the naturalistic therapy, at least me as a mother, it's something I do naturally. And they appreciated that children were able to sort of be kids, right? They were having fun and it didn't mean placing difficult demands on them. this parent, the important thing is that he interacts and discovers more things to do, and it's that he's having a good time. For me, that's important. However, wait time and sabotage, so more environmental arrangement strategies, those were perceived differently than responsiveness. I played videos of a snack time with a dad and his son. The dad was waiting for the child to sign to request a bag of chips. And then he did sign it, and then dad gave over the bag of chips, but he didn't open it. So then he waited again for his child to sign to request his dad to open it. The whole time in the video, the child was like cool as a cucumber, not frustrated at all. But there were a number of parents who felt like that wait time would be way too difficult to implement. They didn't think it felt very natural at all. One parent said, with my son's temperament, it would not work at first. It would be very difficult waiting. And they typically avoided frustrating children, even temporarily. So the idea that children would be challenged in that situation was unappealing to them. But again, a lot of parents were willing to overcome these difficulties and change their natural behaviors if they thought this strategy would be effective in teaching their child important skills. So another quote, I think we're very robotic to do everything for them. In my case, I'm like that. I've had to change everything to be able to help her. I read a phrase that says, if you don't teach me how to do it, what you're teaching me is that you can do it for me. And we have to teach them to do it by themselves. So it's not about giving them the open bag and handing it to them. It's very natural of us as hurried moms solving everything for them. So as a clinician, you might want to tread lightly around these strategies if you use them. Responsiveness might be widely accepted. There is some, it's not clear in other studies if that's the case. In this one it was. If you're using or you're teaching these more environmental arrangement strategies, you might want to spend some extra time explaining the benefit of being frustrated temporarily in order to make the child motivated to learn the skill, right? Or you might provide lots of scaffolding to go along with it, like lots of visual prompts to make the parents feel like they're still supporting the child, even when they might be frustrated temporarily. But at least start the conversation with them and see how they feel about it, knowing that there might be some discomfort there. These parents felt like discrete trials was a common strategy that therapists were using with their children already. And they were frankly open to using this strategy at home. A lot of them were already using positive or negative reinforcement strategies at home, like consequences or sort of longer term rewards. I'm sure all of you are aware of the controversy over how natural discrete trials really are, but my opinion is we do need to consider our whole range of strategy choices when we're working with families, and we want to allow families to decide what's going to work well with them, especially when they're the ones that are implementing it. So when you're working with families, if they see this as a feasible strategy, you might help them learn how to implement more immediate rewards or consequences. Something like a sticker chart might be a good combination of immediate and long-term rewards. All right, so that was all of the mix and match strategies theme. The last theme was unmet needs from service providers. Participants in the focus groups were overall really grateful for the services that they were getting. But when we discussed them further, they opened up about a lot of unmet needs that they had or barriers that they felt like were impeding their child's ability to really reach their full potential. First, parents unanimously wanted more involvement in their child's intervention. We all have to be involved for the good of the child. Even though the therapist works with the child, she also has to teach me how to work with them. I think it's for the good of the child. A lot of parents were noting a drastic difference in their involvement with their child's therapies and kind of the level of family support that they had across service providers. So typically at the early intervention stage, so before age 3, or with private therapists, there was individual therapy and it was often in the home. So the parent usually at least observed and sometimes participated in therapies. However, parents whose children were in preschool or above noticed much less involvement in the public schools. So one person said, in the schools, I don't have much contact with them. Parents shared that school personnel was discouraging them from observing in the classroom during the school day, really to avoid disrupting the class structure. A lot of participants agreed their children would be more likely to behave better and learn more when the parents were not there. I can say that for my own children. But they were disappointed because that meant that parents weren't able to learn strategies to use at home. And they wish that they could at least observe therapy, or better yet, if they could receive training from the therapist or teachers so that they could carry out strategies at home. One person read, it's something like a balance, or sorry, she said, it's something like a balance. It's very good to have therapies away from parents because in my case, the children participate more. They have a better formed structure because they know they have to do it. But at the same time, the disadvantage is that we stay out, so then we don't learn. So there's this sort of interplay between maintaining the structure of therapy versus allowing parents to be involved in it. Now, the parents definitely perceive that to be dichotomous. Participants were often really open to various models of family support. They were open to class or therapy observations. They were open to hands-on practice with therapists or educators. Group workshops for families. One of them said, what we want is for them to give classes to us because the classes, they only give them to the kids. We want a base so that we can learn too. Because so many of them were not getting support from the therapist that they wanted, they were doing their own research. They had turned to the internet to look for more ways to work with their child, and others were seeking additional private therapy. Another area of dissatisfaction was the lack of communication, especially with school therapists or teachers. Parents really valued open communication with their service providers. One of them said, communication is the first key to open up the door. If there isn't communication between the parents and the therapist, there won't be anything. Also, they felt like as primary caregivers, they had really unique knowledge about the child, right? So new skills or behaviors that the child was learning, reactions to new strategies used in therapy. And they felt like it was really imperative for all service providers to know that information in order for their child to receive the most benefit. And they felt that they weren't able to share that information because they didn't have that open communication. A lot of participants mentioned that school providers would give them worksheets or written tips for working with their children at home. They might talk about these kinds of topics during IEP meetings, but for these parents, it wasn't enough for them to then successfully carry out those recommendations at home. So that's kind of related to the involvement in therapy piece. One parent said, at school, I wish I could see, be there, participate, learn, because it's very good, the information they send me, and it's very well explained and everything for me to work with him. But I would still like to see. It's not the same learning from a guide or a paper as seeing a professional doing the things. All right, so they were very grateful, but they did note that it wasn't quite enough. One of the major barriers to open communication, of course, is the language barrier, right? Several caregivers that I did these focus groups with, several of them did speak English, but most of them did not, or at least not above like a basic level. And that made it difficult to build a relationship with therapists and share that imperative information that I was talking about, right? One mother spoke about having a Spanish-speaking therapist and how helpful that was for her and her husband and how they were able to communicate openly. But in general, caregivers shared that there were not enough translators, they weren't given access to translators frequently enough, and they overall emphatically argued for more bilingual therapists. One mom said the moms that don't speak English can't help their kids because they don't know how, because as much as they explain it to them, well, it's Chinese. I haven't been able to understand. And they just talked about needing bilingual therapists so that they could work with these families. And I went back to the survey results again after looking at that theme, and I looked at a few items related to the relationship with parents. And Latin families actually reported feeling more satisfied than white families in terms of developing a relationship with service providers and having providers respect their choices, which was interesting and unexpected. However, in the other survey related to the family-centeredness of care, I looked at the pattern of responses within groups across the subscales. So within the Latin families, they were most satisfied with receiving general information and least satisfied with receiving respectful and supportive care. Whereas in the white families, there was no difference across those subscales within that group. All right, so those were all of the findings. Here, I'm going to talk about sort of the conclusions, and I think there's a lot that we can draw from this and a lot of clinical implications that we can pull from it as well. So first, as you saw, there was a difference between the first round of analysis from those surveys and the focus group data when we were actually sitting down and having real conversations, right? So I think the important takeaway here is that clinicians, if you have time, I know you're busy, but it's important to dig deep, knowing that Latin families need some deeper conversations to share actual perceptions and preferences with you. Secondly, the parents were very emphatic about wanting to be more involved in therapy, right? Both in the early intervention setting and in the school setting. I worked in a school setting. I know how hard it is to get families in or to be able to work with families frequently. Sometimes I think that we think that families maybe don't care or aren't motivated, but the conversations that I had with these families really was not the case. It was the opposite, right? They really did care. They wanted to know what they could do at home because they knew the importance of that. So as much as we can, we need to be meeting parents where they are and trying to share with them how to carry out therapy strategies at home. If it's early intervention, that means telling them up front that they'll be taking an active role in therapy and why that's important, right? And then letting them take that active role. If it's a school setting, finding ways to bring parents into school. Some of the parents mentioned that their preschool teacher had parents come into the classroom during the day once a month, and they made therapy materials that they could take home, and they practiced during the day at school how to use them with their child. They really appreciated that. Or at least letting parents observe in the classroom. I know it's scary and it might involve a little more explanation for why you're doing what you're doing, but ultimately the child is going to benefit. Parents were losing connections with family members and often their greater community in a context when these relationships are ordinarily so important. So I think encouraging families to join support groups would be beneficial for them, finding Spanish-speaking support groups if they exist. If they don't exist, making them. If anybody's interested in doing that, please get in touch with me. I'd love to talk with you. Potentially also offering group therapy, scheduling kids at the same time, or maybe offering parent education sessions in a group format so that these families can build connections with each other. There was also this mismatch between the priorities that families had for their children's future and whether or not those aligned with their cultural values. So as clinicians, I think it's important for us to understand that perspective. And again, to ask the right questions that are going to reveal intervention choices that are most suited for each family. We have choices, right? We tend to go with what works best for us as clinicians, but maybe what works best for us might not be what works best for each family. Caregivers were also really clear about needing more bilingual therapists as a way to improve communication. So we need more linguistic diversity in our workforce. I think that all of us as service providers have a duty to talk up our profession to the people we meet. We have a great profession. So mentoring people, career days, workshops at high schools, if you're motivated to do that, I would encourage you. Finally, it was really evident, as I'm sure it is with other cultural groups, that parents wanted to support their children as much as possible, obviously, right? So keeping in mind some of those therapy strategies that caregivers perceived as especially positive might help us as clinicians to work off of caregivers' strengths and to help them support their children in ways that they will be most successful. Just some final thoughts. Keep in mind, most of my participants came from support groups or community events, not all of them, but some of those conclusions about the more sort of social aspects might be specific to this group of people. The same goes for the fact that most of the families from the focus groups were from Mexico originally. We can't assume that all Latin families are the same, and there's going to be different cultures for each country and region and city and et cetera. These ideas really are meant to be a starting point to start some conversations with these families that might help make their interventions more culturally appropriate. And also, I was not able to repeat these focus groups with the white families. So who knows, maybe we would have found some of the same similar themes. I assume some of them would have been the same. But the good news is when we do this cultural work and we talk to families about what are their actual experiences with interventions, we often find ways that we can improve interventions for everyone, not just for one or two particular cultural groups. A couple of thank yous to funding sources and fabulous research assistants. But I want to just thank you for letting me share this with you all, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thanks for that great question, Michaela. So we do have some questions for you. So the first one is, what are some actionable steps that clinicians and professionals can take to support Latin families?
Yeah, great. So I hope I'm going to pull up this slide. Oh, I'm still sharing. I should not. Well, I'm going to pull this up and then I'll unshare it. So a lot of these things here, I think, are some actionable steps. The most important things that I think, like sort of first goal, I think would be figuring out how to help families make connections and also figuring out how we can involve them more in therapy and get through that language barrier. Thinking about what you can do to bring them towards each other, giving them support groups to go to, and finding ways to bring, more linguistic diversity, I think are two really immediate needs.
Great. So we have a second question. What can be done to combat the stigma of autism in Latin communities?
Great question. I think there is a lot of work being done at this in this area, but we need more, right? There's a lot of materials that are being developed, in the same way that we can think about how there's been a lot of sort of public awareness campaigns for autism in the United States and in English. I think we need to think about how we can reproduce that in other languages as well. Thinking about internationally, because a lot of families are still, have a lot of connections to their home countries. So thinking about, how can we disseminate that work internationally as well, and helping some of these countries see, understand what is autism and what is it not, so that we can kind of start to take away that stigma.
And I think we have time for just one more question. What types of cultural differences cause common autism interventions to be less helpful for Latin parents?
So some of those that we talked about, the strategies, especially those environmental arrangement strategies, I think that the families were seeing those as, difficult to implement, that they didn't want to frustrate their child. They didn't want to cause behavioral problems, right? I think, we talked about one of the specific therapy targets that parents were most interested in terms of priorities for therapy goals. One of those was behavior. You hear a lot about Latin families prioritizing behavior and being very focused on appropriate behavior. And so when you introduce a strategy like environmental arrangement, like wait time or sabotage, and you're just standing there waiting for the child to do whatever it is you want them to do, the first thing that they're going to do is get frustrated, right? And they're going to act out. And when they act out, that can be perceived as negative behavior, as poor behavior. And so when families are really focused on that, and that's a big priority for them, and you're giving them you're making them have this sort of negative behavior, frustration, acting out in those eyes and that perspective, then that's difficult for families. And they might not want to implement that, right? And they might not want to come to therapy if they see you doing it. Right? So giving them, a perspective and kind of sharing what the overall goal is, what's going to happen, checking in with them and making sure that they recognize that, or changing your strategies if you think that, if they perceive that to be inappropriate.